Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our lecture series hosted by the Center for Global Security Research within the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. My name is Asmar Askedo, and I'm the Associate Deputy Director of the Center. Many of you are already familiar with our speaker today, Ambassador William Taylor. Ambassador Taylor joined us twice last year, first in January, right before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and again in May to help us try to make sense of it all. You can find those recordings on our website. Today, Ambassador Taylor will provide a lecture called After Russia's War on Ukraine. He recently visited Kyiv and will provide his insights from the ground. He'll also provide his assessment on the security dynamics that will likely emerge after the war. Ambassador Taylor is currently the Vice President of the Russia and Europe Center at the U.S. Institute of Peace. He's a former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. He's had a long career of serving in various diplomatic positions in the Middle East and Europe. We have a large number of participants today, so let's get started. Ambassador Taylor, thank you for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Esmeralda, first of all, thank you very much for having me here, for having me back. I'm very pleased to be able to speak to your crowd there. It's a very distinguished group, and I'm honored to be invited back. As you say, Esmeralda, I just got back from Kyiv. I spent last week in the capital and around the capital. I was there, got there Monday morning. The overnight train comes from Poland, arrives there early on Monday morning, and then the same overnight train going back on Friday evening, late, gave me a good 5 solid days to talk to people, see things, which I'm glad to use as kind of the structure of this talk, which will highlight exactly what as Brett said in terms of the current status and where we might go from here. I was out there, by the way, with a non-governmental organization called RDI, Renew Democracy Initiative. It was founded by a Russian dissident, oppositionist, Garry Kasparov. Some people were probably aware of him, but I went out there with Max Boot from the Washington Post and David French from the New York Times and Gideon Rose from the former editor of Foreign Affairs, Kori Schake. Many people on this call probably know Kori from AEI and her earlier work. Former Senator Heidi Heitkamp from North Dakota, is the chair of the board of RDI. So it was a good group. And we had an opportunity to talk to a lot of people, which I will tell you about. But last week, many of you probably are aware, President Zelensky was not in Kyiv. He was all over the map. He started off, it seemed like a long time ago, but he started off at the beginning of last week in Rome. Where he met both the Italian government, but also the Pope. Had a long session with the Pope. The Pope, as many people will know, has indicated that he's interested in trying to be a mediator. But when he announced that, it was a surprise to both the Ukrainians and apparently the Russians. And so President Zelensky was there to have a direct conversation with the Pope. He went on from there to Berlin. Received an award that goes to the person who had the greatest effect on European unity over the past year. And so President Zelensky was awarded the Charlemagne Prize for unifying Europe, which he indeed has. He's unified Europe as well as the West, not to mention his own country. From there, he went on to France. From there, he went on to London. From there, he went on to Saudi Arabia, where he met with both the Crown Prince, but also the Arab League. So he met a whole lot of heads of state during that. And then, as we know, on to Japan, where he met all the G7 leaders, including President Biden and all the other G7, but also not just the G7, the head of Indonesia, head of state of Indonesia, the head of state of the Prime Minister of India, was there. Interesting group of people. So all to say that last week, while I was in Kyiv, the president of Ukraine was doing diplomacy. He was building support both political, the possibility of negotiations with the Pope, economic. He had conversations with the Indians about their purchases of Russian oil. He won several big decisions at the G7. In particular, the decision that came out last week on the provision by the West, by NATO, and of the F-16 fighters. As again, many people on this call will know, the Ukrainians and President Zelensky in particular they've been asking for F-16s for months since the beginning, and following the pattern of these requests, the answer for a long time was no. The answer was, from the United States and others was, well, actually, we don't think the Ukrainians really need these F-16s, these kind of fighter jets. We know what they really need, and they need other things, which was true. Just to be clear, it was certainly true that there were other pieces of equipment, weapons, air defense that the Ukrainians needed and eventually got. We can think of how the same pattern on the main battle tanks, the Abrams M1A1 main battle tanks. We know the story of that. For a long time, we Americans, the Biden administration, resisted providing these heavy main battle tanks. But after the Brits offered theirs and started to provide theirs, and the Germans were ready to do this, the Poles, but in particular the Germans with the Leopards, we, in somewhat of a deal, agreed to provide ours as well. All to say that this pattern that applied to the battle tanks, to HIMARS, to Patriots, which we'll talk about here in a minute, it applied now, that same pattern applied to the F-16s, which was no, you don't need them now, but maybe, and now yes. And I will tell you that the Ukrainians, so pleased. They recognize the capabilities of these weapons. The F-16 is the most recent one, but these others have given them a real advantage on the battlefield, which we will talk about as well. I mentioned the Patriots. My little group of visitors was a beneficiary, along with all of Ukraine, of these Patriots. So when we arrived early Monday morning a week ago, we spent the first day in and around Kyiv and around the region. Got back that night. Early the next morning, actually, the Russians fired a large salvo of Kinzhals, of these much vaunted so-called hypersonic missiles. And the Russians had been very proud of these and boastful of these capabilities of these hypersonic missiles, saying that they were untouchable, that they could not be stopped, they couldn't be blocked. Well, turns out they can be stopped. It turns out the Patriots that we had provided and we had trained the Ukrainians on knocked down every one. So they've knocked down 7. The Russians are 0 for 7 on the Kinzhals getting into Ukraine, and the Patriots are 7 for 7 on knocking them down. It's an amazing performance. This lit up the sky on our first night there last Monday. Both the incoming and the Patriots being fired not too far from downtown. I mean, we could see these, both the outgoing and the explosions where the Kinzhals were intercepted. And it was not, by the way, it was not just Kinzhals. The Russians flooded the zone, so to speak. I mean, there were these Iranian drones. There were other cruise missiles that they thought they could get through the air defenses, and the Ukrainian air defenses were up to the challenge. And they knocked down all of the income, in particular around Kyiv. There were a couple of missiles that did get through in other parts of the country. this makes an interesting point, I think, that first of all, the Patriots are extremely capable. I imagine, again, people in this call who study deterrence and Russian capabilities, particular strike capabilities, are analyzing the effect of and the implications for deterrence based on the very effective use of these Patriots against this so-called unstoppable hypersonic weapon that the Russians have. It's very interesting, but it's also interesting how the Ukrainians trained up so quickly out at Fort Sill. They went through the training on these Patriots in a much abbreviated time frame. And the Ukrainians at Fort Sill couldn't understand why the American trainers went home on Friday afternoon, and how come they weren't working on weekends, and how come they were going home at 5 o'clock. The Ukrainians were very eager to learn how to use these weapons, and apparently were very proficient in their studies and their applications, because they were extremely effective on the battlefield, as we saw firsthand last week. But the Ukrainians were so pleased at the performance of these Patriot weapons. We had many conversations last week with the foreign minister and his predecessor, the defense minister and his predecessor, the people in shops. We talked to soldiers, we talked to privates, we talked to generals. I have a good friend who's a lieutenant. We spent a lot of time talking about what their experience has been, their morale, their preparation, their thoughts on this coming counteroffensive, which we'll talk about. One interesting aspect of the conversations with these ministers was this: no matter what the formal portfolio of these ministers, they were on message about how they're going to win on the battlefield, and how much they appreciated the weapons that have been provided so far, and what weapons they still need. Most of the week we were there last week was before the announcement of the F-16s that I just talked about. And so we heard from the Minister of Reconstruction, the Minister of Infrastructure, the Prosecutor General, who's like our Attorney General. All of these ministers whose responsibilities are other than defense were focused on what they need in terms. The head of the Agriculture Committee and the Dean of the Agricultural School also just led off with the appreciation for what we've done, but B, they're encouraging us to provide more. This is to say that the Ukrainian society, not just the government, not just the soldiers, but the people that we talk to out of the government, no matter what their background, are focused on winning this war. This came up. We talked a lot. I probably talked last time I was on with you all when the war was first couple of months about the rationale and what's in it, why we care about this, why it's important to us that the Ukrainians defeat the Russians, how the global order depends on the Russians being defeated. The Russians have violated the principles of the way that we've worked, the way we've interacted, the way the world has respected the sovereignty of other nations. Under the UN Charter, sovereignty and territorial integrity are important components of international law and enshrined in the UN Charter, which the Soviets and then the Russians after them have signed up to. And the Russians violated those principles by invading Ukraine first in 2014 and then again big time last year in February of 2022. And we talked about that. We talked about the importance of reestablishing those principles. And the way to reestablish them is to have the Russians get out of Ukraine. That's the way to reestablish these principles: non-interference, territorial integrity, the principle of sovereignty. That's important. And as important as that is to Ukrainians winning and rationale and why it matters to us and to Europeans and others around the world, those are the big geostrategic, geopolitical issues that are at stake here. And we understand that, and we understand why, therefore, it's important that the Ukrainians win and the Russians lose. One of the ministers described to us the attitude of the people on the street of Kyiv, and indeed the Ukrainians around the country. And it was very interesting. He made the very clear point that if you talk to people on the street, which we did, and he was right about this, and you ask them about what this means, what this war means, what this invasion means, why they are so focused, they as a people are so united. It goes back to Zelensky uniting his country. Why that is, and it doesn't have to do with these international principles. It doesn't have to do with the liberal international order. It doesn't have to do with the security of Europe or the security of the United States being wrapped up, being engaged, being important for the success of the Ukrainians. No. What you hear from the Ukrainians on the street, and this minister made this point, and we heard it as well, is the Ukrainians don't want to live under the Russians. It is that simple. That's why they're fighting. They don't want to live under Russian rule. They've been there. They've been under Russian rule. They were there under the Soviets. They were there under the czars. This goes back in Ukrainian history and consciousness. They know what it's like to live under the Russians. They don't want to go back. They have heard, we all have heard, President Putin say, and the Ukrainians are very tuned in to this aspect of the war, this aspect of the motivation of the Russians. They've heard, as we have, President Putin say that there is no Ukrainian nation. It's only under Russian sovereignty that the Ukrainians can live. President Putin has said and written that there's no such thing as Ukraine, that the people living down there in that part of the world are just really little Russians, according to Putin. And therefore, if those people down there living in that part of what he would say is his empire, if those Ukrainians resist, they can be wiped out. Indeed, that's his goal, is to wipe out Ukraine. And he has gone to great lengths to wipe them out. And they, as civilians, the Ukrainian civilians have been subject to the worst forms of atrocities, the worst form of torture when the Russians were in their country, when they were occupying parts of Ukraine that we visited last week, right on the outskirts of Ukraine. I'm sure last time I talked, and some of you may have tuned in to this conversation, the Russians got to the city limits of Kyiv. They were there in the first days of the invasion, first weeks of the invasion, before they were pushed back out by the Ukrainian military. The Russians got within the city limits of Kyiv with the intent of finding, killing, getting rid of President Zelensky and taking over the country. This is what the Ukrainians know the Russians are about. And this is why the Ukrainians are fighting so hard for more than 15 months now to ensure that the Russians fail, and then to ensure that Ukraine is a country, is an independent nation, is able to go where it wants to go, and where it wants to go right now, it's very clear, is Europe. The Ukrainians are committed now, and again, people in the street know this. they are committed to joining the European Union and NATO. And the support for joining NATO is in 80% or more at this point. So the Ukrainians know why they're fighting. And it's not because of any large geopolitical, geostrategic reason. No, it is because they don't want to be under the Russians. They want to be independent. They want to be part of Europe. And that's demonstrates. And you see this in the morale of the soldiers that we talk to. It's not just the man in the street, the soldiers. Again, privates. There were some privates who happened to be back on leave. They were getting ready to go out, then going back to the front line the next day. They were eager to go. In that group of soldiers, it's interesting, very interesting. There were two Belarusians. Belarus has a bunch of people that have left Belarus and have come to Ukraine and are fighting on behalf of Ukraine against the Russians. And there were two young Belarusians who were in that group. There was a Georgian. There were two, I will tell you, there were two young Americans. They were veterans. These Americans were veterans, and they are part of this international legion that is fighting on behalf of the Ukrainians against the Russians. These veterans, one was a former Marine, one was former Army medic. They were headed right back out, right back out. So this is and you can feel the motivation from the Ukrainians, as well as the Georgians, as well as the Belarusians, as well as the Americans who are fighting alongside. It's an amazing demonstration of that. I also talked to, I mentioned a lieutenant friend of mine, lieutenant in the Ukrainian army. He was also back and was headed out the next day. And he described the kinds of activities that the Ukrainians are using to defeat the Russians. They're very innovative. We've already talked about how quick learners they are on the Patriots. I suspect they're going to be very quick learners on the F-16s as well. But you feel it. You just feel it while you're there talking to these people of all ranks in the military, from the Minister of Defense down to the privates heading back out. So I've got one last issue which I've already referred to, and then I would love to shoot over to the questions from you all. Counteroffensive. The Ukrainians have been talking about this counteroffensive for months now. It's been clear that the preparations have been ongoing. It is clear that the Ukrainian military is putting together new brigades, some from brand new and newly trained soldiers. They are equipped with Leopard tanks. They are equipped with our Bradleys, our infantry fighting vehicles. They are equipped and are now trained in maneuver warfare, in joint operations, to use the artillery, to use the long-range fires, to use the infantry, and to use the armor. So this training in these 9 brigades that are fully equipped, fully trained, and ready to go on this counteroffensive, there are probably at least 3 more brigades that are about at readiness that would allow them to go forward. And there's a third wave, a third level, a third phase of these brigades that are being trained and are standing by for the new equipment. The next round of the Leopard tanks that are coming in from other parts of Europe. Leopards, of course, are deployed by our European NATO allies, and so they're in theater. The Leopard tanks, unlike our M1, our Abrams tanks, which will take more time to train on, and will not participate. Our Abrams will not, probably in all likelihood, be there in time for this counteroffensive this summer. nor, by the way, will the F-16s. The F-16s are likely to start showing up in the fall with the training that needs to go into this. Of course, we've been doing some training already, but nonetheless, this counteroffensive is not going to have the benefit of the F-16s or the M1A1s, but it does have, the counteroffensive does have the benefit of the Leopards, our Bradleys, our other infantry fighting. We have a bunch of MRAPs that we have provided, well as other infantry fighting vehicles from other NATO nations. So this is to say that the preparations for the counteroffensive are well underway. The weather is a factor. That is, you need to have firmer, less muddy ground to deploy these tanks most effectively, to get them off the roads, to be able to engage in these maneuver warfare tactics that are going to be important. And that's coming. We don't know when, we don't know where. And we shouldn't. Because the Russians don't know when and where, and they are obviously nervous. I mean, we've picked up our intelligence pretty good, by the way, and the intelligence that we have is available for the most part to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are very appreciative of the intelligence support that we provide them to enable them to make the decisions about where and when for this counteroffensive. So the punchline here is, they're getting ready, and indeed they are ready. They are focused in all likelihood. You know, the Ukrainian generals have proven themselves very good at the military art. Over in the fall, they took back a whole lot of territory that the Russians had occupied earlier in their offensive, and the Ukrainians have pushed them back. And the Ukrainians have struck in the fall in places that the Russians were surprised, did not expect. The Ukrainians actually feinted toward the south and then attacked in the north, and then later attacked in the south. So I would imagine there's that kind of consideration going on as well in preparation for this counteroffensive, which may, by the way, have already started. Certainly the preparations, as I've mentioned, have already started, but maybe even what the military calls the shaping operations. We've seen a lot of the strikes on rear areas of Russian occupied areas in Ukraine. We have seen the use of these long-range missiles that the Brits have provided, the storm shadows that the Brits have provided. And again, here's another example of what I talked about earlier about other nations taking the initiative and providing a weapon system beyond which the Americans had not gone. And the Brits have provided these long-range artillery, cruise missiles, storm shadows that allow the Ukrainians to strike deep into the rear, the Russian rear, still in Ukraine, still in occupied Ukraine, just to be clear. And this, I hope, will prompt the Americans, the Biden administration, to make the decision, which must be coming, to provide the American version of these long-range rocket artillery, the so-called ATACMS, which we've not decided, which the administration is not yet approved. But again, what the Brits have, it's not the Brits' version of it is not quite as deep. It doesn't quite have the range as the ATACMS, but my bet is it's coming. Just like the F-16 decision, long debate within the administration about whether or not to provide these F-16s. Again, a real debate. So there were people within the administration arguing in favor of providing these F-16s, and only until recently they were losing that battle. But recently they won that argument within the administration. The F-16s, as we know, were just announced last week. And my bet is we're going to see ATACMS go through the same thing. They will be maybe in time for this counteroffensive, because ATACMS, they use the HIMARS launchers, and so the Ukrainians know how to do these, and they can be in theater. We don't know exactly where they are, but they can be there in time for this counteroffensive. This is to say the preparations for this Ukrainian counteroffensive are well along, and the Ukrainians are as prepared, as equipped as they've ever been. That's not to say they can't get more prepared and better equipped with some of these systems that I've just talked about. But right now they are ready. They are ready, and the Russians are at least temporarily on their back foot. At least temporarily, the Russians are probably at a low point. I say at least temporarily because the Russians can draft a lot of Russian men into the army, and they've been doing that. But it takes some time. We've all been watching what's going on in Bakhmut, where after 8 or 9 months of Russian attempts to take that little town, and people couldn't understand. Americans, Brits, think tanks, American officials are saying, why are the Ukrainians hanging on to Bakhmut? It's so painful. Why are they doing this? Well, we said they'll never hold. Well, they did hold. They may have a little bit of Bakhmut still, but may not. They may have been pushed out of Bakhmut downtown, but on the flanks, on the north and the south, the Ukrainians are threatening the Russians again. The Russians are at a temporary low. Their morale of the soldiers is rock bottom. It is very clear to the Russian soldiers that the Russian military, the Russian officials, the Russian leaders don't care about them. And they have these Russian soldiers have been many prisoners, but actually regular soldiers as well have been thrown into the battle and have been massacred. And there's debate, there's anger within the Russian military, both civilian and uniformed military, about how expensive for Russia this fight for Bakhmut has been. This is to say that the Russians are on their back foot. They're at a temporary low point. The Ukrainians are as strong as they've ever been and continue to get stronger. So this counteroffensive could succeed. This counteroffensive could succeed in pushing the Russians back, maybe way back. In the best case, this counteroffensive can strike a shattering blow to this fragile and spent Russian force that's in Ukraine right now. It could be a shattering blow. And what that means is that panic sets in, that it turns into a rout where the Ukrainians mount this offensive and concentrate their forces, these new units that I talked about, spearheaded by the armor, by the leopards that they're now proficient on, been trained on, punch through the Russian lines, get into the Russian rear, cause panic, and that could, and again, this is the best case, that could have a devastating effect to the coherence of the Russian military effort in Ukraine, and it could crumble. It could crumble. The Russian military effort in Ukraine could crumble in response to, as a result of this counteroffensive. Now, that's the best case. It is also possible that the Ukrainians take back some land, but not all of it. And in conversations with both the Minister of Defense and, interestingly, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, they both were very clear about this counteroffensive. They say, if it succeeds wildly, great. That's what we're hoping for. That's possible. If it only succeeds partially, we'll be back. The foreign minister said, this is not the last battle. This is not the last battle. The last battle will come when they, in their view, in the Ukrainians' view, again, top to bottom, the last battle will come when they push the Russians out of their country. That's their goal. The Ukrainians have one goal: push the Russians out of their country, out of all of their country. Let's be clear. All of their internationally recognized borders from 1991 to 2013, That's what they talk about when they talk about winning. It's pushing the Russians out of their country and those international borders. So that's their goal. And if they succeed this first time on this counteroffensive, great. It's not impossible. It can happen. If the Russian coherent military effort in Ukraine fails, crumbles, is shattered, that could happen. But even if it doesn't, even if they just push back partially and push the Russians back, they will continue. They will continue. One of the things that they mentioned to us, and this I will end on. I will end on. Look forward to your questions. They point out to us something that we know, and that is we, the West, the Americans, the rest of NATO, we have a big say in how long this war goes. We have a big say on how this war ends. If we provide the weapons that the Ukrainians need and can effectively use, as they've already demonstrated, if we provide them with the sufficient numbers, quantity, and quality of those weapons, the Ukrainians have shown that they can succeed. They have shown that they can push the Russians out of their country. That's their goal. If we do that, we can shorten this war. If we do that, we can shorten this war by helping the Ukrainians to win this war. And that's what we should do. The Ukrainians have shown unbelievable courage, starting with President Zelensky. I know I mentioned this last time, but I'll say it again. When the Russians were on the outskirts of Kyiv in the first weeks of this war, people went to, probably Americans as well as Ukrainians, went to President Zelensky and said, Mr. President, we need you to lead this country, and so we're going to help you get out of Kyiv so that you can continue to live and continue to lead this country and defeat these Russians. We'll help you get into a safer part of the country. And there were hit squads, there were assassination squads of Chechens and other Russian special forces in the city, in Kyiv. He knew that. And what was his response? He said, I need ammunition, not a ride. He demonstrated courage, and he inspired the Ukrainian people. They've stayed. They've pushed back. They pushed the Russians back out of Kyiv, back into Belarus, back into Russia. They pushed them out of Kherson. They pushed them out of Kharkiv. They have pushed them all the way back to where now the Russians only have about 20%. 20% still under Russian occupation. But the Russians have been pushed way back. The Ukrainians have pushed back under the leadership and based on the courage of President Zelensky, of the generals, of the lieutenants, of the privates, and of the people. The Ukrainian people have demonstrated commitment to those principles that we care about. Those principles of sovereignty, of democratic rule, of the rule of law, of human rights, the violation of Ukrainians' human rights, and the atrocities that the Russians have committed against these Ukrainians. They have stood up. The Ukrainians have stood up and shown courage, and we should too. If we provide them the support, they can win. They can win. And so, with that, let me ask for your questions. Asbred, I know you're going to help me with the questions here, but this has been a great. Thank you for indulging me on the first part of this conversation.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Ambassador. That was really great. We appreciate you sharing your experiences and insights on this topic. As you would imagine, we have a list of questions in the chat already, ready to go, and we also have some hands raised. So first, I'll go to the first hand that is raised. So that's Kevin. We'll unmute you and go ahead and come online.
All right. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
We can.
All right. Well, Ambassador, that was wonderful. Thank you very much for taking the time. My question was, there's been a lot of talk about how U.S. official support could change following the 2024 election and how, depending on the outcome of that. So my question for you is, number one, do you think the conflict could be resolved by then such that a change in support wouldn't matter? And two, if it would still be ongoing, do you think that they have sufficient momentum that a change in support wouldn't ultimately matter?
Kevin, great question.
Thank you.
First of all, if the counteroffensive does succeed in the way that I just described, in the best case, where the Russians essentially are driven all the way out of Ukraine, it could be over. It could be over this year. There have been credible generals whom I listen to, who make predictions. These are retired American generals who have predicted that it could be over. Exactly, Kevin, what you say. Would it be resolved by 2024? It may well be. It may well be resolved this year, 2023. That's the best case. I think even the generals would agree that is the best case. If it's ongoing, based on what we know now, based on what we see now in terms of where the support is for Ukraine and where the opposition is to Russia in this country, and this, of course, what your question is, Kevin, I am confident that the American people and the Congress, both House and the Senate, Republicans and Democrats, bipartisan Congress, will continue to support Ukraine in this fight if it continues, if it's not resolved this year. Why do I say that? When you look at the votes and we look at where the support is in the Congress, which is a reflection of the American people, on the Senate side, there's no stronger supporter of Ukraine, an opponent of Russia, than Senator McConnell, the minority leader. He's been to Kyiv, along with others of his colleagues. I mean, he leads the Republicans. The Democrats have been there. Senator Schumer, the majority leader, of course, he's been there. They've supported. They meet with President Zelensky. They know what's at stake, and they strongly support. So the Senate is solid. The Senate. There are a couple of dissenting voices. 3 in the Senate. On the House side, there are 16 House members who were brave enough to get the wrong answer, in my view, to sign a letter saying that we shouldn't be supporting the Ukrainians. There was a letter that 16 members of the House signed. 16 out of 435. You know, do the math. It's about 4%. It's not a strong. And the assistance packages have gone through bipartisan House, Senate, all the way along. And again, on the House side, controlled by the Republicans at this point, the Republican chairs of the Foreign Relations Committee, of the Armed Services Committee, Republican chairs, strong support for Ukraine. They showed up in Munich, the Munich Security Conference a couple of months ago. I sat on a table with these. It was all Republicans and all committee chairs sitting around this table in Munich, demonstrating their support for Ukraine. This is a long answer to your question, Kevin. I am confident that no matter how long this goes, we will support them, and B, it doesn't matter who's in the White House. I mean, the bipartisan support. That may be a too strong a statement. It does matter who's in the White House. But my bet is that the support for Ukraine will continue past 2024.
Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Thank you, Kevin.
Great, thank you. So I have a lot of questions in the chat. If anyone would like, please just raise your hand. Even if you already put it into the chat, and you can kind of just come online and speak. But I'll read one of them off. So this person asked, Henry Kissinger, according to an interview published in The Economist this week, stated his belief that the war would end with a settlement that would include some territorial concessions. What is your view on this possibility?
So the Kissinger interview was very interesting. I'm glad people have noticed that. And before I get to the question about negotiations, let me just say that Henry Kissinger has now come around, has changed his view on Ukraine in the first instance. He now says, which he didn't before, he now says that Ukraine is an important European country, an important European nation. This was not his view before, but that's important. The second thing he said, not in this interview, but earlier, not too long ago, was neutrality for Ukraine is not an option. And the third thing he said, which I think is he did say this in the Economist interview, was Ukraine should be in NATO. Ukraine should be in NATO. And obviously, this would be a security guarantee for Ukraine. Obviously, it would be good for NATO for Ukraine's military to be part of the NATO established NATO military operation, having demonstrated that they can at least hold off the Russians and indeed defeat the Russians in every battle that has gone forward. And that would be a real contribution to NATO capabilities. But Kissinger went on to say that Ukraine in NATO would be good for Russia. He said that the Russians ought to want Ukraine in NATO in order to constrain it. Henry Kissinger, and this gets to your question, his view of how this ends is, this counteroffensive that we just talked about succeeds to some degree, but doesn't get the Russians all the way out of the country, doesn't get the Russians all the way out of Ukraine. And therefore, if there are negotiations, the Ukrainians, by the way, say they're not going to negotiate until all the Russians are out. But if that changes, and there are some negotiations, as Henry Kissinger forecasts, and in that situation, the Russians aren't yet out of the country. Kissinger argues that Ukraine in NATO would be constrained to try to take back those still occupied parts of Ukraine, that the Russians would still be in Ukraine. And if the Ukrainians were in NATO, that the NATO structure, decision-making, would constrain Ukrainians, would deter the Ukrainians, would keep the Ukrainians from trying to take back the last part of the occupied territory. So on negotiations, as I say, the Ukrainians are not ready to negotiate because they think they can push the Russians all the way out of the country. The Russians are not prepared to negotiate because they claim that those 4 oblasts, which they had referenda in, they partially occupy, they claim that those oblasts are actually part of Russia and that Ukraine must acknowledge that going into negotiations. Ukraine is not going to do that. So the point is, neither side is ready to negotiate at this point. And the Ukrainians make the point that if they were somehow forced to negotiate, which they will resist mightily, but if they were forced to, and some kind of ceasefire, which sounds very attractive, if some ceasefire along some agreed lines were to go into effect, that would reward the Russians for that invasion, that would reward the Russians for the crime of aggression, reward the Russians for the atrocities, would not hold the Russians accountable for these horrible acts that they've done. So the Ukrainians are not ready to negotiate, and the Russians have apparently said they're not ready either. All to say that Mr. Kissinger has some ideas. Some of these are good ideas about Ukraine in NATO, very good idea. I think he's exactly right. On the negotiation side, the Ukrainians are not there and the Russians are not there.
Great, thank you. Next up is Leslie.
Great, thanks, Esmerette. And thanks, Ambassador, for keeping us updated throughout this invasion. I find your insights really valuable, especially because you've been traveling to Ukraine. And so, based on your experiences in Ukraine, how are the Ukrainians perceiving Prigozhin and his Wagner group? How are they perceiving the success in Soledar and Bakhmut? And do they look at Wagner as different from the Russian military?
Good question, Leslie. And the answer is yes. They do look at Wagner, led by Prigozhin, in a different way than they see the Ministry of Defense. As you indicated, the Bakhmut fight was a holding operation for the Ukrainians. They recognized, the Ukrainians recognized that that Prigozhin had probably been given the assignment by Putin to get him a win. He doesn't have any. Putin doesn't have any wins. They've taken some territory, of course. They got all the way, as I said, to the outskirts of Kyiv. They took Kharkiv. They took Kherson. But since then, they've been pushed out of Kyiv, pushed out of Kharkiv, pushed out of Kherson. And so Putin wanted a win. He wanted something to demonstrate to the Russian people, and not to mention the soldiers, Russian soldiers, that there was the possibility of success. And so he told Prigozhin, get Bakhmut. And for 8 months, Prigozhin has been trying to do this. As we know, he was running out of professional soldiers, so he got the permission from apparently Putin to go to the prisons. And of his 50,000 Wagner troops, 40,000, we understand, were prisoners who were promised amnesty if they were to go and fight. And if they were able to come home. Most of them didn't. I say most of those 40,000 prisoners did not come home. They're dead. But they were able to Wagner was able to grind out street by street the Bakhmut fight, to the point where apparently now, with the possible exception of a little bit of one little portion of Bakhmut, the Wagner soldiers and troops and military have Bakhmut. Their problem, of course, is they don't have the flanks. The northern flank and the southern flank had been defended by the Ministry of Defense forces, the regular Russian army forces, that are not doing well. The Ukrainians are pushing hard on the flanks, and the Wagner troops in the center of Bakhmut now are in danger of being surrounded, of being cut off by this pincer movement by the Ukrainians. And so Wagner, Prigozhin has said he's pulling out. Not clear when. He said he was going to pull out this week, or now it's going to be next week, or sometime soon. But he's pulling out in hopes that the regular Russian army will come back and fill in behind him while he pulls out. This is all to say that the Ukrainians know that the Wagner troops did not have any respect for or care about their troops, and they just threw them into the fight, wave after human wave, that were mowed down, wave after wave. And so that's different from the regular Ministry of Defense forces, the regular Russian army forces, and which have been defeated and pushed back on the two flanks. This is all to say, Leslie, that there is a difference between the way that the Wagner troops fight and the Wagner officers throw their men in and care for their men, not much, compared to the army. And the other interesting thing about the Prigozhin is that he has been scathing. Prigozhin has been scathing about Shoigu and Gerasimov. And that demonstrates a fractured, at least a fractured military command, and maybe no unity of command below Putin, which is a vulnerability. And this vulnerability might well be exploited in this counteroffensive. But a great question, Leslie.
Great, thank you. And next up is Peter.
Hi there. Thank you for taking our questions. I have a couple, some really simple ones, hopefully, and one probably more complicated. The complicated one is how to deal with the various Putin enablers. And you alluded to this earlier, responding to Kevin's question. In particular, you didn't mention him by name. If Trump were to become president again, he is clearly not a Ukraine, or at least he hasn't in the past been a Ukraine supporter, and hasn't shown, at least from what I've seen in the media, any indication that that has changed. And then there are the people like Tucker Carlson and various other media figures who, I worry that we're very supportive. Our country is very supportive, and it seems like that's a high percentage is very supportive. But these things can change, and perhaps change quickly. And I wonder if you're concerned about that. My quick questions are nukes off the table? It just seems like Putin, it might, it really probably isn't in his interest to do anything with nukes. But that's still obviously a pretty important question. And finally, my last question, sorry, I've taken advantage, I apologize. What about what do we do if there's a big setback? And what are they planning ahead, managing expectations, whatever? A big issue. This goes back to my first question. There's a lot of support, but if there were a big setback, that could really dent some of that support. Again, my apologies for taking your
No, Peter, no,
Thank
great
you.
questions. Great questions. I don't know how to respond to the possibility of President Trump coming in and pulling out support for Ukraine. I think he would be moving against, if he were to come in and he were to do that, I think it would be moving against the strong support of most Americans, of a big majority of Americans. But it's pretty early to talk about this, and so I have nothing to add to this debate. I will only note that Tucker Carlson is no longer at Fox. Enough said on that. I'm at the Institute of Peace here, and we are nonpartisan and non-political, and so I have nothing really, no insights to give you on that. Nukes. Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you, Peter. I think nukes are off the table. Actually, you can't say that there is no chance that they'll be used because they exist. It's not impossible, but the concern about this has gone way down. Even among people who had earlier expressed a lot of concern about this, has gone down. I talked, we didn't talk about this much last week because I think it is generally agreed that the chances, the probability of nuclear use in Ukraine, tactical nuclear weapon use, is very, very small. I will tell you that the Ukrainians are not losing sleep over this. Ukrainians, they have a couple of responses. They say, what can they do? What can these weapons do? They've already destroyed several cities. More, you look at the pictures of Bakhmut, you look at the pictures of Mariupol, you look at pictures of parts of Kharkiv. The devastation, the damage, the destruction in those cities. I mean, it's, nuclear weapons couldn't do more than that. And the Ukrainians keep fighting. The message there is, and this will get into your last question, the Ukrainians will fight. Ukrainians have said, even if there's a nuclear weapon use, they say, we've seen worse. And we will continue to fight. And again, if we continue to support them, they can win. But they're not cowed. They're not deterred by irresponsible saber rattling. So this is not a big issue any longer. I mean, you can't dismiss it. And there are plans for what the response would be. should they make a bad, Russians make a bad decision, Putin make a bad decision to use these. Devastating consequences, probably a conventional response, not a nuclear response from the NATO side. But deterrence has worked, and I think it will continue. So now on the setback, I mean, yeah, Ukrainians are professional military. They have a lot of plans. Their lead plan is to succeed in this counteroffensive, to punch through the lines, exploit in the rear, and cause the Russian military to disintegrate, and push them out of the country. That is but they know that war is unpredictable. They know that the enemy has a voice, and has actions that it can take, and you can't predict this. They also know that the Russians have a much larger pool of recruits to draw on, and the Ukrainians know that. Ukrainians also know that the Russians have a lot of old equipment that they can pull out of stores, and some of it may not work. But some of it might. So the answer to your question, Peter, is that they do have plans. The basic plan is, as the foreign minister said, this is not the last battle. They will continue to fight. If it's for whatever weapons the Russians bring out, the Ukrainians know that if they stop fighting, then there's no more Ukraine. That they will be wiped off the map, that there will not be a country of Ukraine if they lose. And they also know that they can win. They've seen it. They believe it. It's not just the military that believes that they can win. It's the people. It's the leadership. It's the people in the streets. They're prepared for setbacks. They're hoping it won't be. They're hoping that they can succeed in this counteroffensive. But this is not the last battle.
Great, thank you. Next up, Des.
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, I have a question. How much of this war is being paid for by the U.S. and how much by Ukraine? Is it a loan? Will they pay it back? Will the expense weaken the U.S. as much or more than the Russians? So I'm looking at this from an economic point of view.
Des, there's no doubt who's paying the heaviest price for this war, and it's clearly the Ukrainians. Just in terms of the destruction of their cities, the number of civilians that have been killed and tortured and kidnapped, that price. I know this is not the economic price that you were asking about, but let's just be clear about who's paying for this war. The Ukrainians are fighting this war. They're fighting for their own land and their own community and their own future, but they're also fighting for European future and our security. So that gets to the question you ask about our support. Yeah, so we are supporting heavily the Ukrainian effort to push the Russians out of the country, out of Ukraine. So far, our military support, and we've provided other kinds of support, and I'll come to that in a minute, but our military support is about 5% of the current DoD budget. The current DoD budget, what's some 842 billion. For 5% of that we've provided in terms of weapons and ammunition to the Ukrainians, for 5% of our military budget just this year, the Ukrainians have destroyed about half of the Russian military capability. And so in terms of just, it's just in terms of that kind of support and that kind of investment, if you will, not the right word to think about what the Ukrainians are having to do But for 5% of our DoD budget, to have them blunt one of our two major adversaries, the Russians, the other being the Chinese, obviously, but one of our two, and of the two, it's the Russians who are attacking us in some real sense. It's the Russians who are attacking our partner, Ukraine. The Chinese are a big potential, a big threat. There's no doubt about that. But for 5% of the budget, of the Defense Department's budget, we are supporting the Ukrainians, and they are blunting and debilitating the Russian war machine. So it's a pretty now. So you asked who's paying the most. The Ukrainians are clearly paying the most. We are paying some. Again, 5% of the budget of our defense budget. Europeans are actually also providing a lot. Both in weapons as well as in financial support. So both the Americans and the Europeans are keeping the Ukrainian government going. The devastation, the destruction of the Ukrainian economy, it's down about a third. It's about a third of the Ukrainian economy has been destroyed by this Russian attack. And in order to keep paying the soldiers and to keep paying the healthcare workers and the first responders and the fire people, as well as the teachers, we are providing assistance, budget support, along with the Europeans to the Ukrainians to allow them to continue to exist, to function as a government. And again, that is in our interest. That is, this is an investment in our own security. Now, going back to an earlier question, I think Peter was saying, what can we do? We have to make the case. We have to make the case. We have to continue to demonstrate that we are going to support and why we are going to support. We're going to support because it's in our interest that the Ukrainians win. It's in our interest that the Russians not win, because if they do, then they're smack up against us, the NATO alliance. And then it could well be more than just Ukrainians dying. So we have a lot at stake here. And for 5% of the defense budget, this is a good return. Thank you, Des.
Yes, thank you. Okay, next up is Andrew.
Hi, I had a couple quick questions. Has the decline of influence of Russia in Central Asia and China seeming willingness to, expand its influence there, does that pose any problems for us on the China front? Secondly, having gone through so many munitions and material, Russia's defense exports are going to be severely limited for the I don't know, 5 to 10 year time frame. But does the sort of industrial mobilization of Russia pose any difficulties for long-term defense sales and sort of Russia's influence operations there? And does the performance of the Russian equipment pose any challenges for their defense exports? Thank you.
Andrew, you will be more of an expert on this than I am sure. But let me just respond to those questions. Very good questions on Russia's declining influence in Central Asia. You're right to point it out. There are many different indicators of that declining influence for all kinds of reasons. The Kazakhs actually feel somewhat threatened by some of the statements that are coming out of Russia, saying that Putin wants to go after all kind of historical Russian lands. Well, there are a lot of Russians living in the northern part of Kazakhstan that are uncomfortable. But you asked an interesting question about that declining influence of Russia in Central Asia more broadly. is an opening for the Chinese. Yep, probably is. I think the Chinese, again, have a complicated attitude and a complicated situation vis-a-vis the Russians. But they, near as I can tell, again, there are people on this call who are more expert on the China angles than I. But the Chinese are pretty transactional. Yeah, they don't want Russia to lose. They don't want Putin to lose. But you know, they don't have when they look at markets, when they look at their economics, the European market and the American market dwarf the Russian market. There's no doubt about it. So a movement into Central Asia by an increase in influence of the Chinese in Central Asia is undoubtedly a possibility that will come. Should we be concerned about that? I suppose. I'm not sure what the policy implications of that are. That is, I think we should continue to support the Ukrainians as they defeat the Russians, even though that may have an effect on Central Asia. But on China, I think the support for Ukraine against Russia makes us stronger vis-a-vis China. Overall, I'm not sure about in Central Asia, but overall, I do believe that a victorious Ukraine, with our support, makes war in Asia less likely. That President Xi is noticing the resolve, not just of the Ukrainians, but of NATO and of the West, of the Americans. President Xi probably thought, based on a lot of different things, one in particular, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which they watched very carefully. President Xi probably thought that the Americans didn't have the stomach to support the Ukrainians or an ally. And we've shown them that we do have the stomach to support an ally. And if that continues, that ally can win. And the Chinese will take that lesson. I'm convinced that will make it the war in Asia will make it less likely on that. Russia defense exports. You're absolutely right. The Russian equipment has not proven very useful or valuable or effective. And again, just a great example of this Kinzhal, which I don't think they're exporting, but this is an indicator, a demonstration that the Russian technology is not a match. It can be defeated by Western technology, in particular American technology. The Patriots' effectiveness against this hypersonic missiles is just one example of the qualitative advantage that we have, the United States has, and now Ukraine has, over Russian capabilities. So this, I think, just reinforces your point that the Russians are going to have a harder time making the case that they've got something that others want to buy. The Indians have been big purchasers of Russian equipment. They're probably reconsidering some of that as well. And the Russian defense industrial capabilities are going to be inhibited, constrained by the export controls that we will maintain. I'm convinced that these sanctions on the Russian economy and sectors of the Russian economy, in particular the defense sector, the energy sector, which I know Esmeralda watches carefully, the export controls on the Russians will continue even after the war ends. By the way, the Ukrainians don't talk about after the war ends; they talk about after the victory. So after the victory, these sanctions, I believe, will stay on as long as the Russians are a threat. As long as the Russians have not given up demands for ambitions toward empire, as long as the Russians continue to threaten their neighbors, in particular the Ukrainians, but also other NATO allies, these sanctions will stay on until they've given up empire, giving up their imperial instinct. So I think that will affect their defense exports as well. And they'll be, we've already seen how they're having a harder time to get the chips, to get the microchips, to get the electronics that go into their weapons. They're not cut off totally, because there are ways that people can get around these sanctions, and some are going through, Kazakhstan, and some are going through Georgia, and some are probably going through Turkey, and some probably going through China. But by and large, the export bans have been effective, and certainly constrained the defense industrial capabilities of the Russians. And I think that will continue even after the victory.
Great, thank you. And next up is Matthew. Okay.
It looks like he took his hands down.
Okay, all right. Well, I'll go to, okay, he put it back up. Matthew, do you want to join us? Okay. All right, if you'd like to, just go ahead and ping me on the chat and let me know. Okay, we'll go to a question in the chat. So what does success look like for Ukraine in terms of, does that include retaking Crimea?
Yes. Yes. Ukraine's goal is very clear, and it's not complicated. They want Russians out of their country. Their country means all of their country. All of Ukraine that's designated since 1991, is recognized since Ukraine became independent of the Soviet Union in 1991. All nations, including the Russians, have recognized those international borders, and they include Crimea, yes, include Donbass, obviously. And so the Ukrainian definition of victory, their goal is very clear: just get the Russians out of our country. Now, Crimea is hard. The Ukrainians have demonstrated that they can push the Russians out of Kyiv, Kharkiv, Kherson, that I've mentioned. They can hold them off on Bakhmut until they counterattack, until counteroffensive. But Crimea is hard. There's no doubt about it. Militarily hard. There are those, I've mentioned some retired American generals who are very much on the record, and General Hodges won't mind me quoting him. General Ben Hodges, U.S. Army Europe, retired. He is very upfront and very outspoken, and is convinced that the Ukrainians will be able to push the Russians out of all of Ukraine, including Crimea. In fact, as General Hodges talks about, he makes the case, strong case, that Crimea is essential for Ukrainian viability, economic viability, political viability. General Hodges argues, and the Ukrainians agree, that they have to have Crimea in order to be able to export out of Odessa and the other ports, and be able to operate in the Black Sea. So yeah, Crimea is really important, and the Ukrainians are going, the Ukrainians say, you asked about Ukrainian definition of success, they say yes, all including Crimea. And they go on to say that they're going to take back every square meter, some by military means, like they're doing now, like they have done, and they're preparing to do in this counteroffensive. That some of this, a lot of this Russian-occupied territory is going to be taken back by the Ukrainians using military means, using these brigades that I just talked about, that they're equipping and ready to deploy. But they've also said, the Ukrainians have also said, that some of that taking back could be negotiated. It could be that they'll negotiate with the Russians on getting back Crimea. Will the Russians ever give up Crimea in the negotiations? Who knows? If they are, General Hodges will say that that these long-range fires, which have already started to come from the Brits, which I am predicting will come from the Americans soon, that puts Crimea in range. And so the long-range fires can do damage to Russian forces and Russian capabilities in Crimea, to the extent that the Russians may pull out of Crimea themselves in response to this. Last week, when I talked to the Minister of Defense, he said, this is Minister Reznikov, he said to us, we're going to take back Crimea. And he said, I may not have to expend any ammunition to do that. It's a very interesting comment. They've given a lot of thought to how they're going to take back all of Ukrainian territory. And for him to say something that others have said a little less directly, for him to say that they're going to take back Crimea without firing a shot, it may be because the Russians, crumble and flee, are routed, and that route extends into Crimea. That's possible. But it's also possible what the foreign minister has said. The foreign minister has said that he's going to take back that Ukraine's going to take back all of its occupied territory. But the foreign minister has also said some of that taking back will happen militarily, but some of that taking back could happen diplomatically. So short answer is yes, they're very clear about what they want, what their goal is, all Russians out. And they're ready to do it militarily or diplomatically as is necessary.
Great, thank you. So Matthew, I think we've just unmuted you. So go ahead. Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Thanks. Yeah, so I mean, my question. This is really great discussion, by the way. Thank you. My question was coming back to China again, and how much, regardless of what happens with the Russians, it can't. Yeah, to me, it just feels like this is an interlude leading up to that much bigger potential conflict in the future. How much is China using this as a kind of a testing ground for their own technologies and strategies against NATO technology and strategies as well? I don't know what insight you have on that. Are they actively trying things out, or are they just watching from a distance, or what's their engagement?
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. And there'll be people on this call that are more expert on these questions than I. But my understanding, we have people here at the Institute of Peace who study China much more closely. I mean, I focus on Ukraine and Russia. We've got people here who focus on China, and they tell me, in answer to your question, that the Chinese are watching closely. The Chinese are learning lessons. It's not entirely clear that they are learning lessons about weapons, although that must be the case, weapon systems. I'm sure the Chinese notice that the Patriots were able to knock down the Kinzhals. And so I'm sure that the Chinese are applying lessons to their own military capabilities. I'm sure that they are looking at the broader support that Ukraine has generated, the broader support that the United States has assembled. The Chinese, again, are probably surprised at that support based on what they saw earlier. And so there are those lessons. But the Chinese, I think, are, they've not yet supplied ammunition. The Russians have asked them for 152 ammunition, and the Chinese so far apparently said no, said we're not going to. The Russians have also asked the Chinese to help them evade sanctions by getting some of these microchips that they need for their weapons manufacture. And the Chinese so far apparently have said no. So I think the answer is, yeah, the Chinese are watching carefully. Not clear if they are testing out anything. In fact, they apparently are. I think they are not testing out weapons in the Russian army against the Ukrainians, just because so far we have seen no indication, no evidence that the Chinese are providing weapons to the Russians. So political lessons, economic lessons. One last thing on economic, by the way, I think the Chinese are probably a little surprised at the severity of the economic sanctions that the West, some of their neighbors, of the Chinese, the Japanese and the South Koreans and the Australians. I imagine the Chinese are a little surprised at the breadth and longevity of these economic sanctions on the Russians, and the Chinese got to be a little bit worried about that too. all to say that, yes, I think you're right about the Chinese observing, learning lessons. I don't think they're engaged in the weapons testing at this point.
Thank you very much.
Okay, great. And we've gotten a couple more questions about what does success look like for the Ukrainians. So just one extra thing that a person is asking is, does success also include regime change in Russia?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Again, the Ukrainians have a simple goal: get the Russians out of their country. Now, when that succeeds, as far as the Ukrainians are concerned, if that succeeds, that could have indeed implications for the stability of the Putin regime. Again, there'll be people on this call who know Russian history better than I, but those people will remind us that there have been cases where Russian failure in a war, cold or otherwise, has led to regime change. We can think of the Russo-Japanese War. We can think of, World War I, and led to regime change in the revolutions. Cold War, Afghanistan. They lost in Afghanistan, and not several years later, the Soviet Union disappears, implodes. So what that might happen. That's not the goal of the Ukrainians. It's not U.S. goal either. I mean, our goal is to defend our own security. We are defending our own security by supporting the Ukrainians while they are fighting the Russians, which are a threat to our security. The acute threat, as the Defense Department says, is the Russian threat, as opposed to the long-term threat from the Chinese. But the acute threat is from the Russians, and we are supporting the Ukrainians when they blunt this acute threat. So again, it's that support for Ukrainians winning on the battlefield in Ukraine. If that leads to regime change, that's up to the Russians. That's up to the Russians. We should be doing, and are doing, some contingency planning if that happens. But that's not a goal of the Ukrainians, not a goal of this administration. It is something that we should plan for. We remember what happened in 1991 when the Soviet Union disappeared. It imploded. There were people who were worried, actually, about what might happen if the Soviet Union were to implode. Some people on this call may remember George H.W. Bush, President George H.W. Bush, who went to Kyiv a couple of months prior to the dissolution of the Soviet Union and urged the Ukrainians to stay the course. Don't rock the boat. Keep stable. Don't jeopardize the Soviet Union. And the Ukrainians disregarded that advice. That speech, now known famously as the Chicken Kiev speech. And Soviet Union disappeared. Good diplomacy, good work by a lot of people meant that it was good for a lot of people. And the sky didn't fall. The same thing could happen on the Russian Federation. But that's not our goal. That's not the Ukrainian goal. The Ukrainian goal is very simple: get the Russians out.
Great, thank you so much. So we've reached the end of our 90 minutes. Ambassador, is there any lasting words you want to leave us with?
Thank you. I appreciate it. Again, I really appreciate being able to talk to this group. This is a very respected group that I'm honored to speak to. And I would just end with the courage of the Ukrainians. We should be as courageous. If we are, and if we provide them with the support they need to succeed, to win, to push the Russians out of their country, we will be enormously better off. And our children will be enormously better off. In a world where the Russians have been pushed out of Ukraine and the principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity are reestablished or reaffirmed, that will be a more peaceful world. That'll be a more secure world for us. So we have a lot at stake here. It's up to us to make that case, and people on this call with influence to talk to friends, family, neighbors, Congress people, senators, make this case. Make this case. This is important to us, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you, Ambassador. That was very well said. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to the lab. We really appreciate that. And thank you for those who asked questions and joined us today. I'm so sorry I didn't get to all your questions. But the next time Ambassador hopefully comes, you can keep your questions for then. But thank you so much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks for having me. Talk to you later.
Bye.